My younger brother, David, has always harbored a deep-seated resentment toward me, and now he's asking for my help after our parents disowned him and left me their $2 million inheritance. If you think his resentment stemmed from jealousy, you'd be wrong. He was the favored child, not me. There was no reason for him to be envious. To give you some context, our mother always indulged David. He was the golden child of the family. She cooked his meals, did his laundry, and even asked me to help him with his schoolwork. I was expected to assist him simply because we were family, but I never received the same consideration. I accepted this as I was quite independent, and perhaps it was partly my fault for always meeting his needs without expecting anything in return. He never helped me when I needed it and only approached me when he wanted something. While I was a quiet, introverted kid who enjoyed studying and keeping to myself, he was loud and rough, just like our dad. I also tend to be straightforward and honest, never sugarcoating things, and I believe my mother developed a negative perception of me because of it. This favoritism made David the family's darling, and I didn't mind it much while we were growing up. However, things started to go south when he began bullying and mocking me for being different from him. David would tease me about my height and the fact that I wore glasses. He would sneak into my room, read my diary, and then complain to my mom about what I'd written. When I yelled at him and complained to our parents about him invading my privacy, they would laugh it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. He did even worse things, like nearly breaking my glasses and putting nasty things in my food. Once, he put small stones in my cereal, but luckily, I found them before they could damage my teeth. When I told my mom, she dismissed it, saying it was just one of his childish pranks. This is how my parents saw brothers bonding. Whenever David and I fought, he would zero in on my insecurities to insult me. We went to the same school, so he knew I was being bullied by a few kids. Instead of supporting me, he sided with the bullies, calling me names like ugly loser or hairy monkey, and even encouraging them to physically harm me, saying I was just a big failure. During one fight over something trivial that I can't even remember, David told me to kill myself. While I could easily brush off most insults, that one really hurt because I was struggling with my mental health at the time. I'm doing better now, but it was devastating to hear my own brother say he wanted me dead. Dad was often at work, and Mom didn't seem to care much. She even scolded me once, claiming it was my fault for irritating him. Things progressively worsened during high school. There was a shocking incident when David attempted to set my hair on fire, and unbelievably, our mother defended him, claiming he was merely playing. Seriously, who behaves like that? Thankfully, my dad eventually sided with me and pointed out the gravity of the situation. He even threatened to call the police on David. This moment was a real eye-opener for my brother, as he had never faced any consequences for his actions before. He was genuinely stunned, and my dad made it clear that enough was enough, that David needed to start respecting his older brother. Later, Dad came into my room to talk. I never expected his support because he always told David how similar they were, which was true. Dad admitted that he had waited for years, hoping David would mature, but he was slowly realizing that David was becoming a big bully. Hearing this from my dad was incredibly validating, and I almost broke down in tears. I confessed everything David had done to me over the years, and even mentioned the bullying at school. My dad was shocked at how much I had endured. The next day, Dad spoke to the principal to ensure the bullies were warned about severe consequences if they continued. Later that evening, he enrolled me in MMA classes at our local gym, telling me I needed to man up and stand up to the bullies in my life. I admit that a nerdy kid like me trying to learn to fight might have seemed laughable, but I was determined. I managed my time well, balancing my studies with daily workouts, and those MMA classes completely changed my life, both in terms of confidence and physique. One day, David was up to his antics again. He stole my pocket money, which we received for helping with chores. I had been saving it for a while, and David sneaked into my room and took it. I caught him just as he was about to cycle off with his friends. I demanded that he return my money, but David mocked me, saying all I could do was run to Daddy for help. I don't know what came over me, but I punched him square in the face. He was stunned and fell backward. I retrieved my money from his pocket before pushing him back down. David started crying loudly, which was quite comical. However, my mother rushed out to help him and find out what had happened. When she learned that I had fought him, she was shocked and reprimanded me, saying I should be a better role model for David, who seemed to enjoy seeing me get scolded. My mother complained to my dad about my behavior, saying I needed to be controlled. My dad grimly asked both of us to explain ourselves. I told him how David had stolen the money I had worked hard for and saved. David tried to justify it by saying he needed the money for a date and that, as his brother, I should help him. But Dad wasn't having it. He told David he was lucky I only punched him for stealing because anyone else would have called the police. He went on to tell David that he had no right to take other people's things without their consent. David didn't like that and threw a tantrum, likely hoping our mother would side with him. But Dad remained firm. When David realized he wasn't going to be punished for being hit, he screamed how much he hated me and stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. Following that incident, David began to distance himself from me. He finally understood he couldn't bully me anymore, and even Dad had stopped tolerating his antics. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were equals. Though he could no longer physically intimidate me, David switched tactics, resorting to verbal insults when our parents weren't around. As he grew older, his behavior only worsened. David became angrier and more short-tempered with each passing year. If I asked him a question, he'd ignore me and walk away, muttering insults like nerd or loser under his breath. He wouldn't speak to me directly, often communicating through our mother instead. When I asked why David couldn't just talk to me, she would just tell me to be more understanding of him. I couldn't tell if it was just teenage angst or genuine hatred. Over time, dealing with his constant hostility became unbearable, and I longed to move out and get away from him. I repeatedly asked my mother to mediate a conversation so we could resolve our issues, but she always refused, saying she didn't want to get involved. When I asked her why David treated me this way, she would always brush it off, refusing to acknowledge the problem. Eventually, I earned a scholarship as a top student and left for my dream university. My dad threw a party for me, and even my mom seemed proud. David, however, remained distant, barely acknowledging my achievements. The day I left for university was bittersweet, a mix of excitement for my future and relief to finally escape the toxic atmosphere at home. The first few months at university were liberating. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes, and started to build a life away from the oppressive environment of my childhood. The constant fear of David's verbal attacks lifted, giving me a newfound sense of peace. During my second year at university, I met my wife, Karen, at a frat party through a friend, and we immediately clicked. Coming from a religious background, having kids outside of marriage was frowned upon. However, when we found out she was pregnant during our final year, we decided to get married right after graduation. Our wedding was a small but joyful ceremony. Our parents were happy for us, and we genuinely enjoyed the celebration. At that moment, I believed Karen was the love of my life. I had always envisioned a monogamous relationship, one woman to come home to and share my life with. Despite other women showing interest over the years, I never pursued anything because I was genuinely content in my marriage. Karen was my dream girl, and I never wanted to hurt her. However, I later discovered two incidents of infidelity in our marriage. The first was an intermittent affair with her married coworker that spanned several years, and the second was a brief fling with an ex-boyfriend during a visit to her family. Some might think I was naive, and looking back, I can't completely disagree. Each time, we separated for a while, but I chose to forgive my wife. I didn't want to raise our child in a broken home and believed we could overcome these obstacles. I saw the affair with her coworker as a youthful mistake, a lapse in judgment during our younger years. For a period, things seemed to get better. Although I could never fully trust her again, I did my best to set aside my doubts, knowing that if I chose to forgive, I had to genuinely work toward a fresh start. It's been 4 years since her second betrayal, and I felt confident in my decision to give her another chance. Karen seemed to have changed, and we were genuinely happy, planning our family's future. However, 3 months ago, my world was shattered once more when she revealed that she had been having a long-term affair, and she suggested that our son might not be mine. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. Shock, betrayal, and disbelief washed over me in waves. I couldn't wrap my head around her confession. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, and I was left teetering on the edge of a reality I never thought possible. After days of struggling to make sense of it, I finally mustered the strength to ask her why she had kept something so significant from me, and how she could have done something so devastating. Her reaction was disturbingly cold and detached, as if she were completely disconnected from the pain she had caused. Her vague, emotionless responses only deepened my confusion, leaving me grappling with more questions than answers. I kept pressing Karen for the truth because I felt I deserved to know who the real father of the child I'd been raising was. Eventually, she admitted it was David. My mind went blank, my body numb as I tried to comprehend what she was saying. Karen explained that she and David had grown close when I introduced her to my family, and she stayed with us from Thanksgiving until New Year's. David, who was usually cold and distant towards me, had been unexpectedly warm and polite to her. I was glad at the time, thinking it meant Karen felt more welcomed and at ease. Karen had wanted to fit in with my family, so she often spent time with my mom and, inevitably, David. She quickly noticed the tension between us and asked me about it. I shared the history of our strained relationship, explaining that David and I might never fully repair our bond because of his unresolved feelings. Karen seemed to understand, but made efforts to include David in our outings, hoping it would help us grow closer. Whenever we planned a movie night, she would invite David, and he would usually end up choosing the film. During those moments, David and I exchanged more words than we had in years, which felt like a small step forward. I remember Karen and David hanging out and playing video games together, but it never crossed my mind that it was anything more than casual bonding. Karen went on to tell me that David, feeling vulnerable after a recent breakup, had opened up to her, leading to a friendship that eventually crossed a line. She admitted that David would flirt with her, but she had initially brushed it off as harmless. One night, though, after drinking too much, they took things too far and ended up sleeping together. She claimed it only happened once, but it was enough to shatter our lives. When she discovered she was pregnant, she was too terrified to tell me, praying that the baby was mine. Hearing all of this from her left me completely gutted. Not only had my wife betrayed me, but she had done so with the one person who had already caused me so much pain. The brother I had spent my whole life trying to coexist with, despite his cruelty, had now fathered a child with my wife. I demanded a paternity test immediately, and those days of waiting were pure agony. When the results confirmed that David was indeed the father, it felt like my world was crumbling. Karen's apologies rang hollow. I couldn't look at her or my son without feeling the weight of their betrayal. Meanwhile, our parents were livid when they found out. They disowned David and left me their $2 million inheritance, refusing to forgive him for what he'd done. Now, David has the audacity to come to me for help, claiming he's struggling after losing everything. He says he regrets his actions, but I can't bring myself to feel any sympathy. He tore my family apart, and now I'm left to pick up the pieces of my life without him. David would flirt with her when I wasn't around, and eventually things escalated beyond her control. The thought of my wife and brother sleeping together made me feel sick. Karen confessed that she felt overwhelmed with guilt afterward and decided to end things with him, which explained her sudden insistence on going home instead of spending New Year's with me. I had tried to convince her to stay, but she was adamant about leaving. When we returned to college after the holidays, Karen seemed her usual cheerful self, so I didn't question anything. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. Karen admitted she wasn't sure if the baby was mine or David's, but with no way to confirm, she chose to stay with me because she saw me as the more reliable brother. That was the real reason we got married. My world felt like it was crashing down. The son I had loved and cared for might not even be mine. I asked Karen if she had continued to see David, and after hesitating, she nodded. She confessed that they had always stayed in touch, unable to resist the chemistry between them. They would sneak off to hotels, lying to me about working late, and half of her so-called business trips were actually romantic getaways with David. I demanded to know why she married me if she wanted to be with my brother. Karen admitted that she didn't want to be the one to end our relationship. She saw me as a good father to our son and chose to stay, even as she continued her affair. She said she made a mistake and didn't know when to stop. I told Karen that I appreciated her honesty, but I was packing my things and leaving. She broke down in tears, begging for forgiveness and expecting me to lash out. Instead, I calmly packed my clothes while she pleaded. Karen insisted that if I truly loved her, I would fight for her, arguing that mistakes happen in every marriage. When it became clear that I wasn't going to respond the way she hoped, she switched tactics, saying that our son would suffer from a divorce and that children shouldn't grow up in broken homes. I reminded her that Karen's assertion that I might not even be the father only deepened my hurt. Her tears and accusations of cruelty seemed to stem from a belief that nothing could make me leave her. Perhaps I had contributed to this situation by allowing things to slide in the past. Despite my love for her, it felt more like a sense of obligation because we had a son together and had been a couple since college. Karen continued to insist that it wasn't too late to fix things, but I struggled to believe her. Trust was irreparably damaged, and her reassurances felt hollow. Even if I could forgive her, I could never forget that she had slept with my brother. I've always believed in forgiving mistakes because we're all flawed, but this crossed a line. I left her crying on the doorstep and checked into a hotel. The next day, I went straight to my parents and revealed the entire truth about Karen's affair with David, detailing how they had been secretly sleeping together for years. The shock on their faces was palpable. Initially, my mother tried to defend David, insisting her golden boy could never do such a thing to his own brother. Determined to expose the truth, I asked my parents to remain silent and let me call David in front of them, aiming to catch him off guard and make him believe it was a private conversation. When David answered the phone, I confronted him about the affair. At first, he vehemently denied it, refusing to accept any responsibility. However, when I revealed that Karen had admitted to everything, he shifted blame onto her, calling her characterless. He even claimed it wasn't his fault if women were attracted to him and that he was the better-looking brother. I told him firmly that I would expose him to everyone. David mocked me, saying no one would believe me because he was the golden child. I scoffed at his arrogance and thanked him for confirming the truth, knowing our parents had heard everything. David fell silent, then stammered as he tried to explain himself and salvage his image. My mother, still in shock, demanded an explanation. David fumbled through a weak attempt to justify his actions, blaming everyone but himself and desperately shifting the blame onto Karen. I could see that my mother, once fiercely protective of her favored son, was now a mix of disappointment and anger. In that intense moment, I felt a strange sense of vindication. After years of enduring David's torment, the truth was finally out, and the roles had reversed. David was now the one exposed, his actions laid bare for everyone to see. As David's words faltered, my father, usually reserved in his expressions, couldn't hide his disappointment. He asked me to pass him the phone and began speaking to David. David, my father's voice was heavy with disappointment. What you've done isn't just a betrayal of your brother, but a betrayal of this family. You slept with your brother's wife and continued the affair even after they were married. Your actions have severe consequences and have irreversibly shattered the trust we had in you. I raised both of you to value family loyalty and decency. What you've shown today defies everything I've tried to teach you. He paused, letting his words sink in. Your disregard for your brother's feelings and the lack of respect for his marriage are unacceptable. You've not only hurt him, but also torn apart the bonds that hold our family together. Your mother and I are partly to blame for what you've become, but we will no longer tolerate this behavior. From today, you're cut off from the college funds I set up for you. You'll have to figure out how to pay your university fees on your own. I will also stop funding your lifestyle. Do you think it makes you more of a man to sleep with married women? Let's see how you manage without my money. Throughout this confrontation, I remained composed, though I could feel the weight of the situation pressing heavily on me. Initially, I wanted to scream at David, but watching my dad hold him accountable was the ultimate vindication. I had exposed David's true nature, and it was evident he had underestimated the consequences of his actions. Despite David's persistent protests, my mother continued to justify him. But my father cut off the call, dismissing David's attempts to excuse his behavior. Afterward, my mother approached me and embraced me. It had been a long time since we shared such a moment, and in that embrace, there was an unspoken understanding and support amidst the family turmoil. She apologized for not believing me all this time. My 14-year-old self could never have imagined such a moment of vindication and being embraced by my mother. Following this, my dad helped me find a good lawyer to handle the divorce from Karen. She and her lawyer tried to fight dirty, asking for alimony since I earned more than her. However, her affair worked heavily in my favor. We also conducted a paternity test, which confirmed that David was indeed the father of the child. The news was incredibly painful, worse even than discovering Karen's infidelity. I was furious that the son I had loved and raised wasn't mine. Despite Karen's pleas to continue visiting him, arguing that he shouldn't be punished for the situation, I couldn't bear to see him. He reminded me too much of David, and I hated it. After the divorce was finalized, I felt a profound sense of freedom as I moved into my own bachelor pad. It felt surreal to live alone, having married so young and never really having the chance to experience independence. However, my naturally independent nature allowed me to quickly adapt to my new lifestyle, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. 2 weeks ago, my dad called to tell me he was considering changing his will to exclude David. My dad is incredibly stubborn, and once he decided to cut David out of his life, he stuck to it. David tried reaching out to our family, but my father remained resolute in his decision. David even showed up at our parents' doorstep begging for forgiveness, but they refused to let him in. Even my mother, who usually gave in to David's tantrums, seemed done with him. Though it must have been hardest for her, she stood firm. David never reached out to apologize to me for what he had done, showing he had no real regret. He was merely upset about being cut off from our parents. My dad told me he planned to leave everything to me, ensuring David wouldn't contest it later. David would receive only $1. My eyes widened in shock as my dad had worked hard his entire life, amassing nearly $2 million, including his assets, retirement fund, and life insurance. The only condition in his will was that if my dad passed away before my mom, she would continue living in their house, even though ownership would transfer to me. I was fine with this, as I wanted to take care of my mom in her final days. Somehow David learned about this and, unable to reach our parents, called me yesterday trying to make amends. He explained how he was struggling with college and that after Karen discovered the paternity of the child, she had been pestering him for child support. He said he had no money and was searching for part-time jobs without success. He begged me to talk to our family to start fresh, claiming he really needed my help. I laughed in his face and told him I was done with him. I reminded him that he should have considered the consequences before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. David argued that I was being unfair and that Karen was also to blame, to which I agreed. I reminded him that I had divorced her, making her and the child his responsibility now. He shouldn't be calling me to complain about them, as these were the direct results of his actions. David raised his voice, but I interrupted, reminding him that he was no longer the favored child in our family. David started crying, telling me how everyone, including our grandparents and relatives, had turned against him. While this was true, it was no longer my concern. I told him we were done and that he should never call me again, as I no longer considered him my brother. Since then, I've replayed that conversation in my mind. Despite my deep resentment toward him, hearing him cry, something I hadn't heard since we were kids, did sting a bit. So I'm here to ask whether I should talk to our parents about him, or if it would be better not to. Update 1. Many of you have been asking why I'm no longer in contact with my son, Henry, and some have even called me cruel. I need to clarify that I am not comfortable raising another man's child. This isn't a typical stepson situation. I was led to believe Henry was my son, only to later discover he is actually my brother David's child. This revelation was deeply painful, and I cried over it for days. The main reason I don't want any contact with Henry is that I want to cut all ties with Karen. If I stay connected to her child, she might find a way back into my life, and I need to maintain my distance. You may think I'm cruel or selfish, but I can't see Henry again, at least not for a very long time. Update 2. Many of you correctly guessed that my mother was the one who informed David about my dad changing his will, prompting David to contact me as a last resort. I confronted her in front of my dad, and she broke down, saying that I had punished David enough and that he had learned his lesson. My dad firmly told my mother that if she believed what David did was forgivable. My dad made it clear that if my mother believed David's actions were forgivable, then he could pack his bags and leave. This threat effectively silenced my mother. My dad is known for his stubbornness, and hopefully, this will serve as a lesson for her. Update 3. Reddit. It's been 5 months since my last update. My relationship with my parents has improved significantly. My dad and I now go golfing every weekend, and he treats me more like a friend than a son. Although my mother misses David, she has respected the boundaries set by my father. The last I heard from my cousin was that David had to drop out of college because he couldn't afford the fees. He and Karen are now living together, and he's working part-time as a mechanic. They are raising Henry together, which, in a way, is a positive outcome. I haven't discussed David with my parents, and they haven't brought him up either. For those asking, I'm doing quite well. I received a promotion at work 2 months ago, which has significantly improved my salary. I haven't been dating anyone yet, as I feel I still need time and space to heal. I've been attending therapy, and we'll see how that goes. Thank you for following my journey. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more real-life stories.